Okay, for those of you at home, we just watched a clip which I sent you via email, and it has a link to a clip on YouTube. So before you start watching the rest of this video, go ahead and stop, watch the other video first, and then this discussion will make more sense. Okay, there we go. So what is being said by Slavoj Žižek about ideology? So
we sort of live in a world where things aren't really what they say. It's just a hidden meaning behind stuff like advertising.
Yeah. So one, you have the role of meaning in. You have the role of hidden meanings, right? That's a big part of ideological critique. Ideological critique thinks that there are hidden meanings in most elements of culture. So today, and depending on which critic you're looking at for ideological critique, sometimes this is very much so a direct manipulation on our media by people. This would be something like, corporate leaders or political leaders embed hidden messages within the things that we consume. And this you often especially hear that for things that are more directly politicized, so things like if you have something like campaign commercials or something like that, that obviously the person providing the messages is very directly manipulating. Or it'll be something more like the clip that we just watched, where there isn't anyone particularly behind it, right? So it's just sort of like society continuing itself over time. Okay, so there's hidden messages in most of the cultural things. What else do we get out of that video about ideology? What other things did you notice? What does he say?
Well, when they're having a fight and he's trying to put the glasses on the other guy, it's like he knows that there's stuff out there, he's content and kind of being controlled the way he is. He doesn't want to see the truth because in freedom there's a lot of turmoil, I think, so I was interested to see that.
Yeah, so there's that discussion of this weird scene. First of all, he's analyzing a movie. What movie was that? They Live. Has anybody ever seen this movie? It's not a very popular movie at all. It's a really dumb action movie from the 80s. Just to be frank, right? That's what he's analyzing. But he finds something really interesting in it, right? Which is this... and that's what he's kind of bringing out. It's usually when you get to cultural stuff in sociology, a lot of times it's teasing out sort of these hidden meanings behind things, right? And these can either be positive, in this case he's doing something where it's a very positive reading of that, or it can often be very negative. So yeah, there's this scene in it, right? And what happens in that scene, it's incredibly long. They fight for seemingly no reason. And Žižek is what's really going on here? Why does he not want to put on these glasses? And it speaks to something, according to Žižek, that it's easier for us to remain in illusions. Right? So we live in a world. First of all, there's kind of a baseline assumption to this that we think of the world not often when we think about the world around us, we don't think of it through our immediate experience. We actually think of it through the things that we consume. So we understand, have you ever been hanging out with friends and somebody was like, wow, that was just like it was in a movie? Says that as a comment or something like that. Essentially we use the things we consume as the interpretive frame to understand the world around us. So ideological critique isn't just critique of the media, it's a critique of, to some degree, the very framework that we use to understand the world. And we're comfortable in the world that we have, even though it's not necessarily always in our best interest to be comfortable. So that's kind of the idea there. What else do we see coming out of that? The video, that clip we got. There's one other thing. So, how do we often talk about, do you guys follow this whole thing with like Facebook and Russia? This is really interesting. In the last election, you guys don't know what I'm talking about? No one in here does? Okay, so Russia quite literally had people putting things onto Facebook to polarize American politics during the last election. So quite literally, it would post really extreme things to get people to run further and further in more extreme directions. And they had, I look quite literally like they had, thousands of people that were like full-time, like basically like operatives back in Russia on computers, like trying to convince people to be more extreme and goading people. Right? So you think about that, right? Like that's kind of like, so kind of the idea is that like, oh gosh, where was I going with that? That wasn't something I had planned on talking about. I forgot. What were we talking about right before that? What's that?
The third meaning of the video.
Oh, the third, yeah, we're getting into the third thing of the video, yeah. So, I still don't know how I was tying that in. Gosh. Ignore that, just strike it. Strike it from your memory. I thought I had some connection running there, but it completely lost me by the time I got to it. I expect you guys to have just heard of it, so I was like, by the time I explained it, I forgot what I was saying. Oh, so anyways, okay, third thing. So what's the thing about the glasses? Did you guys catch this? The glasses in the video. So our third thing that he is particularly being brought out in the video has to do with these glasses. Did anybody catch it? Oh, no. Now I remembered what I was doing. Okay. So like often we think of ideology as if it was that, right? And what I mean is like our natural way of going about the world, right, is correct, right? And then somebody intervenes and does something, and then all of a sudden we misunderstand the world around us, right? That's often how we think of politicized messages being embedded in things. It's how we think about ideology. So how is what Zizek's claiming happens very different from that? What's our natural way of orienting in the world for Zizek? It's not that we've gotten somehow steered off, but that everything we normally think of as normal is actually wrong. That's sort of Zizek's assumption, right? So basically, like, whatever emotions we have surrounding our identities and our politics and all of that, right, that is ideology. And it's not that people are pushing us further in weird directions or something like that. Well, in reality, like to understand what is actually going on in the world, we have to find a way of divorcing ourselves from ideological messages, right? And his point is this, that we've often grown up in them. So you think about this too, like, okay, so regardless of which political side, like this sort of stuff often transcends like our left-right politics, so it's not really good to think about it that way, right? But like, have you ever noticed that most people have the same politics as their parents? So why do you think they have the politics they do? Because they grew up with it, right? And so basically the idea is that those messages aren't come through direct experience and interaction with the world. They come to us through, right, just being raised in it. And where did those people's parents probably get their political messages from? Their parents, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth, right? And so whether we're talking about our attitudes towards politics or our attitudes towards work or our attitudes towards whatever, right, they're not gained through direct experience of the world. They're gained through, right, this sort of like continuation, this training that we grew up with, right? So that's kind of what Zizek means, is in a lot of ways we grew up, and if your baseline assumption is that the system that we live in is just fine the way it is, then that's fine, right? Like, you're growing up and you're trained into the system. But if you think that there's something fundamentally wrong with the system we're living in, which ideological critique grows out of Marxism usually, which baseline assumption of Marxism, and Marxism isn't a scare word in academia like it is in like
the regular everyday world. So, so Marxism doesn't usually mean like Marxist revolution, like we're gonna like have Lenin and create totalitarianism in Russia. Like that's not usually what it means in academia. It's more this sort of stuff. But anyways, its baseline assumption is that the world we live in is broken, right? That our economy exploits people, that our politics takes advantage of people, that it kills people, that it's dangerous, right? And that we could do something better, right? But there's all this crap, right, that gets in our way. That's its baseline assumption. So within that world, like, if you're just sort of following off of what impulses you've been trained into, well, you're actually reinforcing often what's very bad about the system that we live in, right? And so that's why Zizek is sort of like, if we just go about our lives, we will have exactly the same thing we have now, which is kind of broken. But if we can find a way of getting outside of, right, what we understand about the world, how we view it, how we think about it, then we have the potential to be able to do something very different, possibly better. Does it make sense? So his point being is this, right? Like, when we walk around without the glasses, that's what's false, right? But we have to, instead of finding a way of, well, like, it's not like there's a curtain in front of us and we have to find a way of getting rid of the curtain. Like, no, we have to find something that will warp our view of the world so that we can actually see it for what it is. Zizek calls this the parallax view. So that's one example of ideological critique. Do you guys kind of get some of the feeling of, what it is and why we do it? So basically what most people who do ideological critique will is, in a lot of ways, they're going to do exactly that. They're going to just take individual pieces of media and try to figure out, what are the messages in it? What is it saying? And how is that either something that moves us forward or something that holds us back, right? And it can be anything. There's a huge amount of literature critiquing the hidden messages within culture. I'm going to give you guys a couple more examples of it. Any other thoughts or questions people have on Zizek in that video clip? Oh. One of the founders of ideological critique, and probably the most like go-to sort of like it's a group of people, is something called the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School are they're a series of sociologists, philosophers, etc., that get kicked out of Germany. So they have to flee Germany during World War II, and they come to the United States, and then they sort of formulate their own school of thought in the United States in the 1940s and 50s. And they're kind of the founders of modern ideological critique. And one of the big things that initially the Frankfurt School is very interested in figuring out what are sort of the things that caused fascism to happen, right? And then they're interested on, is there anything like that in the United States? Particularly as people living in the United States who had just fled, right? So this is the initial start of their project, right? So they're very interested in how things like a movement towards authoritarianism happens, which is actually often very relevant today. Like, I'm not sure if are you guys aware of the authoritarian stuff in politics today? I see a couple of people nodding. We're moving towards authoritarianism worldwide. There's more authoritarian leaders now than there probably has been ever in the history of the world. Across Asia, Europe, North America, we're increasingly moving towards more authoritarian forms of government. There's a huge literature on this, right? So I think like the Frankfurt School is, in fact, in that way has seen a sort of revived sort of question of like, what is it within our culture that would move us towards something like authoritarianism, right? And so for the Frankfurt School, one of the things has to do with how we use the word freedom. So, what do we mean by freedom? What is freedom? And that's a very big question. What's freedom?
Having autonomy for oneself. Being autonomous.
Having autonomy. How can we, I like that definition, we can stick with that. Did anybody else want to throw in a different? And we can kind of view having autonomy in more than one way. So like, how could autonomy be good? In what way is having autonomy a good thing? What's the word autonomy mean? Just so we all know that. It's like you're what? You can type it in if somebody has a device out too. Give us a textbook or dictionary definitions, since it's an everyday word. Did you have your hand up? Did you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, when you said how is autonomy good, I was thinking like kind of a more theological definition of freedom would be kind of having the ability to do what one ought to do.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what my mind goes to when I think of freedom.
Yeah.
But I think with autonomy, it's just like having authority over yourself.
Yeah, and I think like that's a very good theological definition of freedom, but I don't think that's like the everyday definition that most people
that's
function
just what
off
my mind
of.
goes
Yeah.
to in terms of how autonomy could be good, and like our choices in this world, obviously freedom and ethics are very like correlated.
I see two people with, did you want to go first and then we'll jump back to Charles?
I looked it up and said the right or condition of self-government.
Yes, so autonomy, yeah, is the right to govern yourself. You're sort of in control of yourself. What were you going to say, Charles?
The exact same thing.
Oh, you looked it up too. So how is that a good thing? How can being in charge of yourself be a good thing? I know this seems like really obvious, right? Because we always talk about how great freedom is, but why is it good? Go ahead.
I guess because you're not restricted by anything. You can just do whatever you want, I guess. Well, not, I wouldn't say do whatever you want, but certain limitations.
Yeah. Anyone else want to weigh in on it?
You're self-reliant. You don't have to rely on much else.
So you're self-reliant. You can kind of choose your own way. We would refer to that in Frankfurt School would refer to that as positive freedom. How's freedom a bad thing? How can freedom or autonomy be a bad thing?
It can be abused.
How so?
Like people could be like, oh, in American countries, like I can do whatever I want, and then
You can hurt other people with your autonomy, right? Is that kind of what you're...
yeah.
Yeah, you can hurt other people with your autonomy, right? Well, how else could it be a bad thing? And this is negative freedom, right? So negative freedom, yeah, you can hurt other people with your freedom.
There could be like no unity.
Oh, so we can create a lot, freedom can create a lot of discord, right? Like extreme freedom is sort of anarchy, right? Also, like, freedom also exposes you to risk, right? So if you're autonomous, like, you think about like, okay, so having autonomy, governing yourself, an extreme version of governing yourself would be like, I don't know, like being a hermit in the wilderness, right? Nobody can tell you what you can or can't do. You can spend your whole day walking around outdoors in your boxers. Nobody can harass you for that, right? Because there ain't nobody around. But in the end, everything, you're entirely reliant on yourself. You have no help from anyone else, right? That's kind of like a metaphor for how freedom often works. So often, being autonomous also means you're exposed to all kinds of risk. You embody all of your own risks and no one gets to help you, right? And that's a form of negative freedom, right? So one of the members of the Frankfurt School, a guy by the name of Erich Fromm, is the guy who does this definition. He wants to claim that increasingly in modern societies, we favor negative freedoms over positive ones. There's been a shift towards negative freedom, right? And we often use freedom as an excuse to judge other people, right? And not feel like they don't need to be helped. We get this language all the time, right? Like, particularly like if you think about like the ethics around like hard work in America. Often we want to blame people with problems. Is it just being them being lazy and not working hard enough, right? So like, if you want to know why inequality works, it's because people don't work hard enough, right? That's actually an embodiment of the language. If you're thinking at the world through a Frankfurt School narrative, this is an ideology that we repeat to one another, right? To make sure that we don't actually see people who are struggling as human beings, but actually instead impose more risk and more danger on them, right? So that'd be an example of our society very much so promoting a negative form of freedom over a positive form of freedom, right? And so increasingly because of that, people have a tendency to some degree want to be protected, right? Being exposed to risk all the time makes us vulnerable, makes us afraid, it makes us want to be protected, which is, for Erich Fromm, why we've had a movement towards authoritarianism, right? In his time in the 40s, Erich Fromm's been dead for a long time. But in the 40s, he was saying that essentially, like, why did Europe move towards authoritarianism in the 30s? It was because of this fear, right, that invaded the negative freedoms of democracy. So they gave up their rights to somebody who they viewed as strong. Has anyone ever seen like old propaganda from like World War II for authoritarian figures? Like one of the really famous ones is, do you guys know who Benito Mussolini is? Benito Mussolini used to have pictures of himself in the news all the time, skiing bare-chested in the mountains. So he'd just be like, I am Benito Mussolini, right? Look how strong I am, skiing bare-chested, right? Why is that appealing to people, right? Well, if you're feeling very vulnerable, the idea of you have a strong leader who can take care of you, you can just sort of give everything up to him, very appealing, right? You actually get very similar images of, you guys know who Vladimir Putin is, right? The current leader of Russia. Has anybody ever seen the pictures of him riding on horseback? He has all these pictures of him riding on horseback, bare-chested. He's like a KGB guy, an old spy, right? So he's like ripped, riding on his horse. And it's like, look at your leader, right? Like, look how strong I am. Why is that appealing? To me and to a lot of people, you look at that and it seems obnoxious, right? But why is that appealing to people? Well, they feel like they need somebody to take care of them, right? And that's because our system has become so reliant. If you're thinking at it through Erich Fromm, right? Because it's become so reliant on negative freedom. So if you want to look at ideology, you look at these sort of messages, right? In terms of that, and then you can kind of see the sort of forms of authoritarianism. Fromm and or Adorno, who's another famous member of the Frankfurt School, also did all these studies about people's attitudes in the United States and found that often they said things that showed a sort of latent authoritarianism. And a lot of it had to do with attitudes about being protected and giving themselves up to the state and so on and so forth. Right? And so they wanted to argue there was this latent thing. So if you want to understand the culture within the United States, they were like, there's a latent potential for authoritarianism, right? But you have to kind of dig underneath the surface to see it. Right? It's not as obvious as it was for something like, Benito Mussolini or Hitler or something like that, which is still to some degree true today. Okay, so let's relate this to one of their works that has more to do with art. There's a great discussion of emotion in art. And this is still Frankfurt School. So, still Frankfurt School. So, why do you consume, and we mean art in like the broadest sense, so this can be television, movies, music, why do you consume it? We all consume some form of art, right?
Because it's entertaining.
Because it's entertaining. So, and you could read that in and of itself through an ideological critique, like why do we need to be entertained? What's that? I didn't hear what somebody said.
Human nature?
What's that?
Is it like human nature?
To some degree, there's human nature, right? But like our entertainment takes a certain form. What are some really popular shows or movies right now?
Friends.
Friends. Friends has been out for a while. I'm surprised it's so popular still. I see you still watch it. Why do you watch Friends?
I think it's good. It's funny. It's, yeah, entertaining.
What's that?
I said I watched it because of Jennifer Aniston.
Let's take a different one. What other things are really popular right now? What about things like comic book movies? There's a ton of comic book movies coming out all the time, right? Why do people find comic book movies entertaining? To be honest, like I don't. I'm not trying to be like all like bougie and snobby, but like I just don't get the CG'd action sequence thing. Like they're like half an hour long. Like I completely stop paying attention after 5 minutes. I just can't help myself. But like, what's appealing about a superhero?
He's invincible.
He's invincible. So we could tie it directly in with like that's, essentially like, Superman really is just a foil for like Stalin or somebody, like, right? Like we want like this person who's ultimately strong just to like take all of our bad guys and lock them in prison or beat them up for us, right? What else is good about something like a comic book movie?
It's sort of like imaginative. So obviously, since people can't fly and don't have superpowers, when we do see it like as realistic as it can get, in a movie, then it's more entertaining than other things because we're not used to seeing it.
Yeah. It creates kind of like a world that we can kind of step into that's really outside of our own reality, right? My question is why do we need to escape from our reality so much? Like, why is that how we entertain ourselves? So that's one question, right? So like in that way, like it serves as an ideology because it hides us from actually the fact that we do live in kind of a scary, frightening world, right? Does anybody here feel like, so like, I don't know about you all, but like partially because like you can't go anyplace, and partially because like I find myself more nervous more often about things. Like since I've been having to shelter at home, like I watch a lot more television. Does anyone else find that they do that too? Right? And that's because it's a great form of escapism, right? So as things in our world threaten us, right, we escape into those realities, right? That's kind of dangerous in and of itself, right? It's dangerous in terms of like reality keeping going the way it is and not changing it, but it's also dangerous because like if you think about it, like the way we use television is kind of like heroin, right? Like that's why do people take heroin? It's because it takes them out of the world for a little bit, right? That's why do people drop acid? It's so that they can leave the world for a while, right? That's the appeal of it, right? And so if you think about it, like art today often is just sort of like, it's sort of like a mediated form of acid, right? It's a mediated form of narcotics use, right? So like there's something strange about that. Okay, why else do we consume art? Why else do we, let's think about something like music. Music doesn't create a world that you step into as much. Why do you listen to the music you listen to?
Because you relate to it.
What do you mean by that?
I don't know, sometimes you can just relate to the music.
So you feel connected to the words of it?
Yeah.
I always think of, maybe I'm wrong here, but I always kind of feel like you listen to music because it makes you feel something, right? Like regardless of what that is. Is I the only one who feels that way in the room?
Well, like sometimes, like depending on what, like how I'm feeling, or like what time of the day it is, like I'll listen to different like kinds of music. So yeah, like it just kind of depends on the mood.
Yeah, like you might want something really active if you're cleaning, or like, and maybe I'm leading us a little too much, but like traditionally the Frankfurt School has taken this idea of like art is primarily about emotion and studied like that historically, which I think is really interesting because actually art hasn't historically been about emotions. It's been about something very different. So like before modernity, does anybody know what most art was for? Who produced the most art?
Well, like it calls you, like I'm thinking about like religious art, so like it calls you
Yeah.
to like the heavenly, so it kind of brought you out of yourself, or like, I think if you're thinking about more classical art, it made you feel very small. Like, you're like, oh my gosh, there's so much more than just me, I don't know.
Yeah. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Yeah.
Yeah, kind of the same thing. A lot of the early arts were more like, we have rules and we're gonna paint about it and stuff. We're gonna paint about like history, whereas like Impressionism and all the other art forms that came afterwards were about actually expressing something about yourself in the art and not just relating something that was supposed to be important to you.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, that's and Benjamin, I told you I was going to wind my way up to Benjamin, right? Benjamin talks about the ritual function of art, right? And it's exactly that. Like, art before is connected to specific rituals you do, right? That's something that is, so it's connected, like, literally art is church art, right? So, and that's kind of what you're describing when you talk about, like, the colossal architecture of the ancient Greeks. Like, it's supposed to make you feel small, right? Or like stained glass is supposed to sort of fill you with this feeling of reverence, right? That's kind of like the idea of it originally. So which I know is a feeling, but it's not a feeling in the same way. It's hard to explain. But anyways, it functions as ritual, right? As ritual. Or it is communicative. As in it communicates content. Right? So I think if you think about like medieval cathedrals, it's a great example of that, right? Everything inside is meant to connect and tell you something about like stories that you may not have access to otherwise, right? So like art is particularly communicative. So in medieval theater, I think this is really kind of an interesting and strange thing. If somebody in the audience was particularly important, like in particular, like if they were particularly well known as like a thinker, they would put out a chair on the stage and then they would just sit amongst the performance. Right? And so the idea was, it was like, if you think about it, like the audience isn't expected to feel something, they're expected to be thinking about it. Right? And even like if you take like earlier forms of music before, like you said, before Impressionism, like something like Bach, right? It's all about like numeric arrangement, and so you're supposed to be like listening to the arrangement. You're not supposed to feel anything. You're supposed to be thinking about what's happening. That's very different from how it works today, where most of our art is emotionally driven. And how does emotionally driven change the art? It changes the relationship between the viewer and the art. Right? Because the viewer, before, whether he's performing a ritual or thinking about the content of the art, is meant to be active. They're active in the art. So you think about like, this is the difference between going to a rock concert and doing something like going to a liturgical church service, right? And what I mean, you guys know what I mean by saying a liturgical church service? It's where you follow through the parts of it. So like, there's set things that you sing at different points, there's set things that you say at different points. If you go to a rock concert, right, you're not an active participant really in the rock concert. The entire tone, everything that happens, right, is produced by the artist. Like no one listens to you at a rock concert. If they do, they're annoyed, right? But at a liturgical church service, right, you go through these steps and you're always supposed to be actively engaged in it. You sing along with the songs. You repeat things back when you're supposed to repeat things back, right? So a ritual is something active, and so is actively thinking about something that you're consuming, right? Emotions are often in art passive. So today we are passive in our consumption.
Another way to put it, and this is how the Frankfurt School often likes to put it, is we're rendered into, rather the producers of art, consumers of it, right? So it got tied up in this sort of like consumerism, eating, drinking, right, kind of. Consuming, buying things, like buying a t-shirt and listening to music is a very similar activity now. So you are not the active producers, you consume it, right? So that also means that art gets the right to elicit in its audience whatever kind of emotion it wants, and we get trained in a lot of ways to just follow it, right? So there is something weirdly fascist about that, and that's kind of their point, right? And emotions in art are difficult to control. So do you guys know the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony? You know that piece of music? Does anybody know what that was written for? Beethoven wrote this as an adaptation of a poem that was about, it was basically during like democratic revolutions, and it's a poem about like humanity coming together and creating like this sort of democratic future. And he set it to music, and that's what the Ninth Symphony is, right? And it's supposed to fill you with this sort of like marching forward feeling, right? That is also the official hymn of the Third Reich. Right? So you think about that, right? When you activate people's emotions, if you are capable of activating people's emotions, you're capable of manipulating them, even outside of the content of it, right? The words don't necessarily matter if you can get people to feel the right feeling that you want them to feel, right? So we moved into this direction of being passively controlled by our art, which is Frankfurt School would call kind of like the birth of ideology. So ideology is about us being passively controlled by the things we consume, which didn't exist prior. Okay, we got 3 more minutes. Anybody want to comment or say some thoughts on the critique of ideology? Okay, cool. That rounds out our discussions of culture. I believe next week's social psychology, right? Yeah, social psychology. So we'll be moving from this very big stuff to what's the smallest level within sociology, people interacting. So have a good day. Have a good weekend. Be safe.